he is not going to win the votes he needs by going harder and harder right.
Because normally he's absolutely attuned to what the public thinks, and he needs to change direction fast. But this is also the Farage paradox, if we can call it this. So Friday night was interesting, Kamal. I had written my column on reform, making the general point that I thought that Nigel Farage had been drinking too much MAGA Kool-Aid. I had noted that Rupert Lowe had done an interview with Andrew Pearce in the Daily Mail in which he seemed to be questioning whether his colleague Nigel Farage was fit to be Prime Minister. I thought, that's curious. I'm going to make this the whole topic of my piece. Is Nigel Farage basically so beholden to Donald Trump that he's losing focus because he's adopted this quite anti-Ukraine stance, and it doesn't seem to be being appreciated by the Reform fan base in its totality?
And he used this word, didn't he, Camilla? Messianic. It was like the Messiah. This
Yes.
idea that, as I said, you and I have talked about a lot about reforms, amazing progress over the past 2 years. But would there be a problem in the end with the way Nigel Farage leads? And suddenly Rupert Lowe, in this interview, as you say, brought out the Messiah complex issue that could surround Nigel Farage. So that was the first point. And then what happened?
The theme of my Friday was basically, is Farage being too Trumpian in different aspects of the word? Is it all too much of a one-man band? I filed the column. I'm waiting to go below the line to speak to Telegraph readers. And suddenly a bombshell drops in our inbox. And it's a statement from Reform Chairman Zia Yusuf and Reform MP, and he's described as chief whip, which is a strange term to use about a man in control of just 5 MPs, including himself. But anyway, Lee Anderson basically making some very serious allegations against Rupert Lowe. Let's go through them.
The first of them is that party chairman Zia Yusuf, as you say, he accused the MP for Great Yarmouth, Rupert Lowe, of twice making threats of physical violence against him, allegations which have now been reported to the police.
It was also suggested that there had been bullying allegations made by 2 female staff members in Rupert Lowe's office, and that a complaint had been made to the parliamentary authorities. We should make it clear now that Rupert Lowe denies the allegations. He has been on X a great deal this weekend, pushing back against what he called allegations that have been, quotes, maliciously concocted to drag my name through the mud with zero credible evidence against me, all because I dared to pose a few reasonable questions of reform's leadership.
And then another twist has happened over the weekend. Rupert Lowe said that the KC, who had been brought in or is being brought in to investigate the allegations from these 2 females in his office, Rupert Lowe has actually also said that it's not allegations against him as a bully, but within his office by these 2 women. So there's obviously quite a sharp distinction there. But the KC that has been brought in, Rupert Lowe said that person who hasn't been named, we know it's a woman, but she hasn't been named, was shocked about the allegations, and he said there was no credible evidence against him. So the KC then comes out in this statement to Chris Mason saying that the way that Rupert Lowe had described her opinion of the investigation was wrong. In this statement, she said, I find myself in the unfortunate and regrettable position of having to make this statement to correct the record. I have not expressed either dismay or shock at any time as to the process, nor have I said there is zero credible evidence against Mr. Lowe, let alone said this repeatedly.
So basically on Friday, I'm being told to rewrite my column, which I do. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, my goodness, I've got to get Nigel Farage on my show on Sunday. He resists that idea because he says he's fully focused on the May the 1st elections. He writes for the Sunday Telegraph. So we've got this ongoing war of words. We've got Rupert Lowe coming out with all sorts of claims, including that one of the reasons the party has tried to silence him is because he was so outspoken on migration. For example, in a post on X on Sunday, Rupert Lowe called for 1 million illegal immigrants to be deported, but then made this point, Farage might not agree with me on this, even though it was the right thing to do. I think we're seeing a split, aren't we, on the right of the right, with Lowe saying that he wants to be more robust on immigration and Nigel Farage having to occupy a more moderate space because he's, of course, trying to appeal to Tories. So I think Farage has concluded Reform has already picked off the kind of hard righties that it can. It now needs to pivot towards the Tories. That is why Nigel Farage rejected the idea of welcoming Tommy Robinson in the fold, which in turn prompted ex-owner Elon Musk to suggest that Rupert Lowe would be better to lead Reform because basically Nigel Farage wasn't right-wing enough, which kind of raised eyebrows over here. So that's the sort of genesis of this. There's clearly a power struggle has been going on for quite some time since Musk made those comments in January, because although Farage laughed them off, the idea that somebody else should be leading Reform than him, I think, must have really rankled. He writes for the Sunday Telegraph, basically accusing Lowe of a series of outbursts, often involving the use of inappropriate language, and said that Reform has acted responsibly. So his argument as leader is, we couldn't allow this to fester. We had to get it out into the open. You know, we need to be seeing justice to be done. I then end up interviewing Richard Tice on my GB News show on Sunday. And bless him, I felt a bit sorry for him, because what a hospital pass that you then have to go onto the broadcast round and have to face up to journalists saying, what on earth is going on here? Because it wasn't just the claims themselves and the timing of the claims. He's then having to answer questions on Farage's behalf about whether he is actually messianic and unable to delegate and too Trumpian and being a one-man band. But also, he's having to insist that Reform is a party of governance, not grievance, as I put it to him. And he didn't do too badly, but I'm looking at Reform now and I'm thinking, goodness me as ever, Kamal, what a difference a week makes in politics. 5 minutes ago, we're going on about their meteoric rise. They've got the momentum behind them. And now it looks like an absolute car crash, doesn't it?
Let's hear a little bit of that GB News interview with Richard Tice that you did on Sunday morning. It's well worth a listen and a watch.
What I know is, for example, we're all working incredibly hard. We've got May elections on the 1st of May. Yeah. And whilst we're doing this hard work, for example, Rupert's not even been to our head office, just down the road. Okay. No interest in the May elections. We need a united team that is going to drive forward. We're heading in the polls.
If you need a united team, why are you
it's not very united.
This dirty washing in public?
It's not very
We've
united.
We've now got this unedifying war of words
of course it's
between Rupert Lowe on X, Nigel Farage in the Sunday Telegraph. It looks amateurish. You're meant to be a professional party. Are you a party of grievance or governance?
We are a party with the right policies to save this country. Right. Things like mass immigration, on scrapping net stupidity.
Hang on. Of you, and you're fighting like rats in a sack. How on earth is Nigel Farage going to command hundreds of MPs, which is your aspiration for the next general election, if he can't keep 4 MPs in check?
Because the truth is, we're working incredibly hard. We're going to work the hardest over the next 4 years. We're going to have the best candidates and the best policies.
You're working
hard.
Hang on.
And that starts on May the 1st this year. Then it goes into the devolved nation elections next year. And we're going to prove it by results.
There's
That's
a history
what we're
here, though, isn't there? Because Rupert Lowe isn't the first person to complain about the one-man band nature of Reform, Nigel Farage having a huge ego, this idea that he's got a kind of messiah complex. That's also affected you, because you were the leader of Reform, you get pushed aside, Nigel Farage comes back. You've got to be honest that bred resentment within the party. I know it has, because I've got good sources close to Reform.
Completely opposite. I was delighted and thrilled.
Opposite.
I'm the one who was thrilled and invited Nigel. I said, get stuck in, it's serious. I'd taken it from whatever, 0 or 1% to in the low teens. I knew that Nigel could drive it forwards. Without Nigel, none of us would have been elected.
As you say, Richard Tice there in a difficult position, because we all know that if a political party is fighting itself, the public look at that, particularly in the present situation. You've got war on the eastern borders of Europe. You've got Donald Trump throwing boulder after boulder into sort of the world politics. And here is a party that is saying that it wants to prepare the long journey towards becoming the possible government, fighting like rats in a sack. I spoke to a very senior member of Reform this morning, well, actually 2, and they both said some similar things, which I think are useful. Exactly as you say, there is this sort of what might be described as sort of Spartan reformers, the initial fighters who are very aligned with the hard, I don't mean harder in a pejorative sense, but just the tough edge of reform on things like immigration, our culture, defending the UK's identity. That has got them to the position they are in now. And this very senior member just reminded me, we've gone to 220,000 members from 60,000 a year ago. We now have 415 branches. We are selecting councillor candidates to stand in 1,500 seats, which is incredible. He said to me that they hadn't stood in 93% of the last council election seat. So this is quite a small organisation just trying to make itself a political party ready for May the 1st. So the Spartans get them to the 20%, 25% in the polls. But if you want to go from the 25% to the 32, 33, where things start really changing in your favour in terms of winning seats, you have to appeal not to that group, but to a slightly more, I'm not suggesting centrist, but a slightly more centre of the right group of people. And one point that was made to me was that Nigel Farage has actually been pretty silent on immigration for quite a long time, as he is trying to show that this party is a party that can encourage those that at the moment might look at them, see this flirtation with Tommy Robinson and the harder right, and find that too difficult a jump to make. And they also know that they are fishing in fertile waters because Kemi Badenoch hasn't lit the blue touch paper back for the Tories. She isn't getting the moves in the polls that many people thought. So there are good, rich areas there for reform, but they've got to focus on the more bread and butter issues, the economy, the health service. And I hear that where they want to get themselves to is crime, is crime, and that's going to be the area where they feel they can pull people across. So these are real, what are called kitchen table politics, rather than slightly culture wars, we're all at threat, everything's a complete mess.
It's so odd that we now find ourselves in a scenario where Nigel Farage is being accused of being not right-wing enough on some issues. You mentioned the point about immigration. This is where I think Farage is at. And I don't remember if I told you this before, but did I ever tell you the story of Nigel Farage coming back from the jungle? And he was a little bit tipsy because he hadn't drunk for however many weeks you're in there. And I think he might have had a few sherbets on the plane towards the Trick Awards, which are these television and radio awards that are voted for by the public. So they're the only ones that GB News has any chance of winning, because we're still seen as sort of too anti-establishment to compete, apparently, with the BBC and ITV and Sky. So we go along, and he was really full of beans, Nigel, because he had had a good innings in the jungle. And he was talking to me about it. And I said that my children have been following it along very closely. And he sort of gave me this line where he said, it's astonishing, the effect of being on a show like that, a primetime ITV show. He says to me with pride, I used to be mobbed at Aldi and now I'm being mobbed at Waitrose. And there was just a little window into Nigel Farage's soul there. And I thought, that's so interesting. This sort of enfant terrible of politics kind of wants to be accepted by the mainstream. He wants to be the people's politician, and it's important to him that he takes Middle England with him. And so, of course, it's politically astute to pivot towards the Conservatives rather than further to the right. He's done the whole kind of right-wing thing. It's important to him, I think, not to quite be as divisive as he makes out. I mean, I get this whole, well, some people love me, some people hate me. I think like all politicians, there's an ego there. He doesn't want to be hated. He wants to be accepted as somebody who has been almost one of the most influential politicians of his era, frankly. He really has been. And, I think he also thinks to himself, hang on a minute, I could have gone over to Washington, been in Team Trump, earned a hell of a lot of money as a commentator for Fox News and others. I'd made quite a lot of money from I'm a Celebrity. I could have built on that. I got my GB News show. I didn't need to re-enter the political fray because I did that. And Richard Tice admitted this to me in the interview. I have enabled you, Rupert Lowe, you, Richard Tice, you, Lee Anderson, you, James McMurdoch, to win your seats. You wouldn't have won them without the Farage factor. And now, after everything I've sacrificed and everything I'm trying to do to try and make reform mainstream, to try and give me a chance of being the next Prime Minister, you're going to start slagging me off to Andrew Pearce, who, by the way, is my GB News colleague as well as working for the Daily Mail. He will have also been upset by how many negative comments were posted under that interview. So Pearcey, as we know him, writes a subsequent piece saying that when the Rupert Lowe interview went out, below the line on the Mail Online, which is influential, let's be honest, there were loads of negative comments about Farage. And I think that will have upset him. And look at the Telegraph response to this. It's interesting, Kamal.
I think that his strategy is exactly the right strategy. And I think that Rupert Lowe's problem, and we're going to need to see how this investigation goes on. There are significant points that have been made by the Reform Party and significant allegations against Rupert Lowe's office and Rupert Lowe directly, which he denies. So we need to see what happens there. And I would advise them to act quickly. But where Farage is correct is that he is not going to win the votes he needs by going harder and harder right. And given Ukraine and Putin, in the public's mind, Nigel Farage has a Putin problem, has said he admires him as a strong leader, has suggested that Europe should never have poked the Russian bear, etc. That has gone down badly with a huge number of voters. And we've done a poll this morning on our website. And I must admit, Camilla, I was quite surprised by the response. Obviously, we have a lot of, very firm reform supporters in the Telegraph and amongst our audiences. But asked, is Nigel Farage fit to lead a reform? He does win, but 56% to 44%, and there's been 8,500 votes on that. And then, so that's closer than I would have imagined. And then, can Reform UK survive this civil war? Now, 61% say yes, but 39%, so nearly 40% say no, and nearly 60,000 people have voted on that. So the public, in a moment where there is a significant global crisis, which is very concerning to voters across the UK, Reform is involved. Rupert Lowe decides it's that moment to start this criticism of the leader of Reform, who is already under some pressure over his position on Putin. And then the war starts because then these allegations are revealed. And I tell you who is delighted by all this, and that is the Labour Party.
Yes.
So Labour are so concerned, the clever people in Labour are so concerned by the fact that they have not been able to offer the type of voters who can see so much in the offer of reform, an alternative that this government could offer them. And the two people who are always named to me by very senior government figures who lead on their campaigning were Zia Yusuf, the chairman. Obviously, Nigel Farage, that's a kind of given.
That's a given.
That's a given. But the two people that were said to me were Zia Yusuf, the chairman, and Rupert Lowe. Why? Because Rupert Lowe has run a business. He's been chairman of Southampton Football Club. He knows what he's doing to operationalise an organisation. And for Reform voters and Reform backers and the Reform leadership, it is the fact that it is their two possible star players, Zia Yusuf and Rupert Lowe, underneath Nigel Farage, that are the two that are at war. It's like Blair Brown, It's the two people you don't want fighting.
Although I would make this wider point. If we leave the Westminster bubble, right? And we have been dealing a lot with Telegraph readers who are very tuned into Reform, people on X who are Reform supporters. They understand the intricacies of these relationships between these different Reform MPs. May I humbly suggest that the man and the woman on the street couldn't name another Reform MP besides Nigel Farage. The idea that anyone else should be leading Reform than Nigel Farage is preposterous in my view. He's the political operator of the moment. He's the best political performer. He's the best political orator of all of them. This is why I made my initial point in my initial column before I had to rewrite it, that this anti-consensus stance on Ukraine and Trump and Russia does betray a very uncharacteristic lack of political nous from him. This is why he's making a mistake with it, because normally he's absolutely attuned to what the public thinks, and he needs to change direction and change direction fast. But this is also the Farage paradox, if we can call it this. For the very reasons that Farage is successful could also lead to his downfall. So when people say, well, there is no reform without Farage, that then leads to criticism that it's a one-man band and that he's messianic. But in order for reform to be successful, he has to be messianic. Also, he may well be justified in saying to himself, well, I can't delegate to these people because I've got Rupert Lowe trying to knife me in the back. This is the other problem. And he will rightfully, I think he rightfully has that ego because he's the Brexit man, okay? He's the one that's nearly helped to destroy the Conservatives. He's the one with the social media following among the young. With respect, I'm not sure people are watching on TikTok Rupert Lowe videos. So he may be slightly drunk on his success since July the 4th, on his Trump links. He may even be a little bit drunk on that ever-burgeoning social media following. But he's kind of justifiably the big cheese in reform because he's the big cheese in reform.